Shavua Tov.
What? How are you?
Baruch Hashem, how are you?
Good. We survived the snow till the next one.
It doesn't make any difference anymore. It used to be that we had snow days.
Right.
Now it's like, well, too bad for you. You're still working. So, yeah. I mean, my car was completely buried. I don't have an inside spot. I'm outside, so on the street. So
what
it
you
was
do?
a nice.
You waited it out, or you uncovered it?
I uncovered it, but I didn't take it out because I was scared I wasn't going to find a spot when I came back.
Uh-huh.
So, I mean, it's like that was on Thursday. So I figured out whatever errands I had to run, I would walk.
Got it.
It's fine.
We'll see what happens tomorrow, right?
Yeah, I mean, isn't it supposed to like snow again a couple of times during the week?
Something like that. I don't.
It's fine. I mean, I don't have far to go most of the time, so.
That's good. Okay, I'll give it a couple minutes. Hanan, we can start.
Can we start at the Mishnah? I know that
I was
went further, but okay, good.
There's no reason not to.
I mean, I read it, but.
So I don't say this lightly, but this is a hard daf. So.
Okay.
So make sure you drink your coffee or whatever it is.
Yes, it is coffee. Always after Shabbos. I don't know why, but
Okay, and it's all kachim, so you'll feel like we're back in Zvachim, or not Zvachim really, more than anything. Says the Mishnah. It's not so clear exactly what this Mishnah is doing here either, but we'll see as the Gemara unfolds the connection. It says the Mishnah, Chamisha Dvarim. There are 5 karbanot that are ba'in betuma. You can bring them even though you're tameh or the animal's tameh or there's some tuma involved. Ve'eno nechalim betuma. But you can't eat them bituma. And so we are going to get to Pesach, which of course is our connection. But before we get to Pesach, 5 karbanot, which are all karbanot tzibor. You recall the principle, which we will refine, is that a public karban is dochet tuma. So that if there is no alternative, whatever that means exactly, then you can bring the karban tzibor, even though it's tameh or you're tameh, assuming there's no alternative, right? However, says our Mishnah, although it comes betuma, you can't eat the animal betuma. Meaning you'd have to bring the karban, but you can't eat the part that you normally eat. And those are the following cases. Ha'omer, the karban ha'omer, which if you recall is brought on the second day of Pesach, right? So there was both an animal and a mincha. Let's start. Just the mincha to omer. It's a karban mincha. Shtei halechem. Now shtei halechem is a little tricky because remember the shtei halechem are 2 loaves of bread that are brought on Atzeret, on Shavuot. They're not really brought on the Mizbeach at all. You bring these 2 loaves of bread, you bring a keves with it, you bring a lamb with it, right? A sheep with it, and you put them on top of the sheep, and then you shech the sheep, and then the bread's eaten. So there isn't really any part of the shtei halechem that goes on the Mizbeach, but we're going to discuss that as we go further. But they can be brought b'tumah. Lechem hapanim, which is, are brought every Shabbat. They would bring lechem hapanim. They'd sit on the shulchan for Shabbat. Again, the lechem hapanim were not brought on the Mizbeach either, but with the lechem hapanim were the bezichim, right? You had the incense that was put on the shulchan that was brought on the Mizbeach. So that karban. Zivche shalmei tzibor, karbanot of shlamim of the tzibor, and Rashi points out that we bring shlamim to the tzibor only one time of the year. And those are the shalmei atzeret. Those are the karbanot shlamim that are brought with shtei halechem. Every other karban tzibor is either a chatas or an ola, right? So the only shlamim that's brought for the tzibor are the shalmei atzeret, right? Kifsei atzeret, that are brought with the shtei halechem, and seirei rashi chadashim, and the seirim, which we're going to bring this Friday, right, on Rosh Chodesh. So on Rosh Chodesh, there's a seir echad, right, and they would bring that seir there were 2 seir, right? Shnei seirei. They brought 2 seirim on Rosh Chodesh. We'll lay in on Friday. We'll catch up. So these are the 5 things that they are brought b'tumah, but you can't eat them b'tumah. Continues the Mishnah. Ha-Pesach sheba b'tumah. Now remember, Karban Pesach, the Torah very clearly says that if you're tameh, you don't bring a Karban Pesach, right? That's explicit. That's the tameh. But we learned, and we're going to say this again, that that's only tumah of a yachid, you're dochet. But if the tzibur is tameh, meaning if the majority of the people are tameh, then you are not dochet the Pesach Sheni, and you bring the karban on Pesach Rishon, even though you're tameh. So says the Mishnah, Pesach sheba b'tumah, ne'achal b'tumah. You can eat it b'tumah. So unlike the first 5 things in the Mishnah, where you can bring them but you can't eat them, the Pesach, if you bring it b'tumah, you can even eat it b'tumah. Why? Shelo ba mitchilato ela la'achila. The whole purpose of the Karban Pesach is to bring it to eat it. The Torah says many times, and we'll quote this, that you have to eat the Karban Pesach. And so therefore, if the Torah permits you to bring it, it permits you to eat it also, unlike the other Karban. Okay? Says the Mishnah, anytime you have a number, you say 5, you could have just said, all Karbanot are brought b'tumah, are not eaten b'tumah, except for Pesach. Why do you say chamisha lemute mai? What are you excluding from your list? Says the Gemara, lemute chagigat chamisha asar. You're excluding the chagiga that's brought on chamisha asar. Okay. What's the chagigat chamisha asar? Remember last week we discussed chagigat yodalid, which is brought on Erev Pesach. The chagigat chamisha asar, which Rashi says means also the chagiga of Sukkot and of Shavuot, is the regular chagiga that you bring to be samachta b'chagecha, where you bring to be happy on the chag. So I would have thought, says the Gemara, I would have thought to say that kivan the karban tziborhu, since it's a karban tzibor, now it's not a karban tzibor like a shlamim, but it's a karban that's brought by the entire tzibor. Right? It's not an individual karban. It's not like you make a shlamim and say, I want to give a gift. Everyone who comes for has to bring it. So since it's a karban tzibor and kvia le moed, and it has a fixed time, right? So obviously there are some karbanot that you can bring them anytime. So if you're tameh, wait till you're tahar. But this has to be done on the chag. So since it's a karban that's brought by a tzibor and it's a karban that has a specific time, I might have thought tidchi tuma, that if you're tameh, you could do it anyways, just like other karbanot tzibor. Kamashma, that's wrong. Why? Kivan itle tashlamim kol shiva, since it has tashlamim kol shiva, meaning you have to bring it on the chag, but you don't have to bring it on any day of the chag. So well, every chag has a Shabbos, right? So if it's Shabbos, lo dachya Shabbos. The karban chagiga, since it's in the private karban, even though it's done by a tzibor, is not docha Shabbos. And says the Gemara, the Shabbos lo dachye tuma. Since it's not docha Shabbat, the concept of being docha tuma is connected to Shabbat. If you can't do it on Shabbat, you can't also do it if you're tameh. So that's the chiddush of our Mishnah, is that the chagiga of any chag is not docha tuma, because it's not considered to be something that is docha Shabbat, and if you're not docha Shabbat, you're not docha tuma. Says the Gemara. I'm sorry?
Or the individual or the tzibur? It was tameh.
The individual.
Individual.
The worse than bringing, yeah. Says the Gemara, v'nitni nami sirei regalim. And again, why don't you also say the sirim that you brought in the regalim, meaning the karbanot that were brought on for the tzibor on a regal? Why don't you include those as well? Says the Gemara, well, that was included. Hatani lezivchei shalmei tzibor. When we talk about the zivchei shalmei tzibor, which again are only brought on Atzeret, that included all the karbanot that are brought for the tzibor on the regal. Well, if you're including all the karbanot, yihachi sirei rosh chodeshim nami lo litni. So why did you tell me about Rosh Chodesh? Right? If the Zivchei Shalmei Tzibor includes all public sacrifices, so then what Rosh Chodesh is not a private sacrifice. You brought one for the whole community. So why do you have to tell us? Tana Zivchei Shalmei Tzibor, right? Because you already said Zivchei Shalmei Tzibor. Amri. So the answer, now we're at the top of Ayin Zayin, which is today's daf. Sirei Roshei Chodeshim Etzrichalei. You in fact need to explicitly add a 5th case of Sirei Roshei Chodeshim, even though you already told me that karbanot of the tzibor on the chag are docha tuma. If it's salkadai techamin, I would have thought to say halok tiv b'moed, right? One of the unique things about it, remember we learned b'moado afilu b'shabbat, b'moado afilu b'tuma. You do this on this time is set. But by Rosh Chodesh is not a moed. Rosh Chodesh is, again, it's a set time, but it's not a holiday. So since it doesn't say moed, I would have thought that Rosh Chodesh is not docha tuma. You just skip it. If everyone's tamei, just don't bring the sa'ir. Kamash Malan, that no, Rosh Chodesh is ikmi moed, that there is a aspect of holiday or of kovea time to Rosh Chodesh. Kedabaya, the very famous statement of Abaya, Damar Abaya. Abaya said, this is a whole different context, but the Abaya said, Tammuz dahu shata meluye malye. We're talking there in Shavuot about the Churban Abayit. So that year, both the Meraglim and the Churban Abayit. But that but he's talking here about actually the Meraglim, right? So the year that they did the Meraglim, remember the story was that the Meraglim went out on the first day of Tammuz, okay? And they came back 39 days later, right? And so they came back for 39 days later. On 39 days later, if there's 30 days in Tammuz and 9 days in Av, they came back on Tisha B'Av, right? And that's what the Gemara says, that heralds the Churban that would happen hundreds of years later on Tisha B'Av. But that assumes that the year that Tammuz had 30 days, right? So says Zabaya, Damar Abaya, Tammuz da Haishate Miluye Malye, that Tammuz of that year, meaning the year of the Meraglim in the desert, was complete, meaning it had 30 days. And the Chtiv Kara Alai Moed Lishvar Bechurai. I called an extra Moed, here referring to Rosh Chodesh, that there's one extra day of Rosh, in the month, and that's going to lead to me destroying my Achurai, my chosen people. But the context, again, is talking there about the Churban, and the destruction of Tisha B'Av. But the point is that you call Rosh Chodesh a Moed in this context. Okay, now again, it's obviously not the same level of Moed as regular Chag, but there is an aspect of Moed, and because of that, a Karban is Docha, the Karban Tzibor of Rosh Chodesh is Docha Tum'ah, and you would do it you would bring it even if the person was Tameh. Continues the Gemara. L'meimra. Now, what you have told me indirectly, which is the way the Gemara loves to teach it to you, is Dekulu mimoed atu. That basically the fundamental question here about bringing a karban when you're tameh depends on the concept of moed, the concept of it being a fixed time, right? Moed means time, right? Like moadim. Minan imili. How do we know that? So it says in Tanur Rabbanan, this is the Braita that teaches us the halacha. The Braita says the following. Vayidaber Moshe et Moadei Hashem. Of course, right? We know this pasuk very well. So this is a pasuk in Emor that is talking about all the karbanot, but also Rashi points out here, also the Shtei HaLechem, the Omer and the Shtei HaLechem, right? Because in Emor we talk about Omer and Shtei HaLechem. So it says Vayidaber Moshe et Moadei Hashem, Ma Tamul Omer. What are we adding by this extra pasuk? Says the Braita, Lefi shelo lamadnu ela tamid v'Pesach. Because previously you only knew that 2 karbanot were dochet tumah. What are the 2 karbanot? The tamid, which is brought every day, right, and on Shabbat, of course, and the karban Pesach, shenemar bahu b'moado. And we learned out b'moado afilo b'Shabbat, b'moado afilo b'tumah. We've quoted this before. We'll quote it many more times. That it says both by tamid, by the karban tamid, and by Pesach, the word moado, its own time, meaning do it in its time, come heck or high water, right? No matter what's going on, whether it's Shabbat and whether it's Tum'ah. So all I would have known, again, this is Lumar speaking this through, all I would have known is that you can bring the Karban Pesach and the Karban Tamid, even if the Tzibor is Tameh. Shar Karbanot Tzibor Minayin. So how would I know other Karbanot Tzibor? Shenemar, because the Pasuk says, now again, this is not our Pasuk yet, the Pasuk says in Bamidbar and Pinchas, it's when it lists all the musafim, right? Remember in Pinchas, there's all the musafim. It says, Elo tasu la'Hashem b'moadechem. Do these karbanot for God in their times. And we learn from there that even if you're tameh, and even if it's Shabbat, right? Now remember, in Parshat Pinchas, which we read all the time, it only mentions the musafim. It doesn't mention the Shtei HaLechem and the Omer, right? The Omer and the Shtei HaLechem are only mentioned, not the only place, but they're only mentioned in this context in Emor, in Vayikra, right? So from that pasuk, I would only know the karbanot. Minayin the rabot Omer v'hakarevimo. How do I know to include the karban Omer, the mincha, and the animal that's brought with it, and the Shtei HaLechem v'hakarevimam, and the 2 animals that are brought with them? Talmud Lomar. That's why this pasuk in Emor says, "Vayidaber Moshe et Moadei Hashem el bnei Yisrael hakatuv." Kava moed echad lekulam, that all of these karbanot, including the Omer and Shtei HaLechem, have a fixed time, a moed, and that moed means that even if you're tameh, you do it, and even if it's Shabbat, you do it. Okay, that's the Braita. This is all a Braita.
That's all the Braita.
Period. Now, ask the Gemara, Kol Hani Lamali. I don't get it. Why do you need? Remember, we just said basically 4 psukim, 1 to teach you the tamid, 1 to teach you the karban Pesach, 1 for all the musafim in Pinchas, and 1 for the Omer and Shtei HaLechem. Why do you need 4 psukim to tell you that moado even on betuma. Why do you need 4 different verses to tell you this? Says Gemara Tzricha. You need all 4. If it had just said by the karban tamid, hava amin, I would have thought, 1 second. The tamid shekain tadir v'kalil. The tamid is a very special karban because first of all, it happens all the time. Unlike it happens every day, right? Very, very frequently. And furthermore, it's all entirely brought on the mizbech. Right? The tamid was not eaten at all by man; it was just entirely burned. So it's very special. Right? It's pure, basically. Avo Pesach, I would have thought if I just said the tamid, the Pesach lo, because it's not every day, of course, and it's not brought on the mizbech completely. So kamashmal, and that's why we then had the Pesach, which is the second one. And Pesach, if we just had the Pesach, I would have thought, where am I? Ikat Rachman of Pesach. I would have thought Pesach shu anush karet. Once that Pesach is a very, very strict mitzvah because the Pesach is the only karban that if you don't do it, your Torah says nichruta, you get karet, which is very, very powerful. Avot tamid de'ein anush karet, but karban tamid, where it never says if you don't do the karban tamid, it doesn't say what, but it's like any other mitzvah. If you don't do it, you don't do it, but it doesn't say you're chayiv karet. Emalo, so I would think, well, it's not that strict. You don't do it if you're tameh, right? Kamash malan, that both. The ikad of Rachmana Hani Tartin, if the Torah just said these 2, right, then I would have thought Hava Amina, well, it's just karban tamid and the karban pesach, Tehu Dieshlan San Chamor. They're both very strict in some ways, meaning they're not the same stringency, but they both have stringencies. Tamid, which is Tadir V'Kalil, tamid is both done every day and it's completely burned up. And Pesach Shu Anush Karet, and the Pesach, which is very, very strict. Avol Shar Karbanot Tzibor, I would think, well, they're not as important maybe as a Tamid and Pesach. Not that they're not important, don't get me wrong, but they're not as important. Shar Karbanot Tzibor Emalo, so I would think maybe those are not. Katuv Rachmana, Einu Tasel Hashem B'Moadechem. That's why we had to say in Parshat Pinchas that all of the Karbanot Musaf are done on their Moed, meaning even Shabbat and even B'Tumah. Says and obviously we're focusing on Tumah here. Even B'Tumah. If we hadn't said the 4th pasuk, I would have thought, well, maybe Shar Karbanot Tzibor, but in the Chaper, right? All Karbanot are brought, as we say in the pasuk, as a kapara, right? Of course, the Gemara asks what the kapara is for, but every karban is brought the Chaper Alechem to be a karban, a kapara. Remember that the karban omer and shtei alechem, their function was to permit you to eat the grain. Remember, the omer is what permits you to eat grain, shtei alechem is what permits you to eat saurim, right? Aval hatir ba'alma ninu. Lo, I would think that since the omer and the shtei alechem are not ba'an the chaper, they're only ba'an lahatir. They're not as important. They're not for God as much as for people. Kamash milan. Says the Gemara, well, why don't you go backwards, right? Why don't you just say Omer and Shtei Alechem, right? To basically say it in Emar about the Omer and Shtei Alechem. Omer Shtei Alechem, the Chudayo, I would have said the opposite svara. Havaminu Adarabba. I would have said the exact opposite. Omer Shtei Alechem Da'alima. They're more powerful because they actually effectuate a heter, right? Once you bring the karban Omer, everyone can go eat their sandwiches. Till you brought that karban, you can't eat chadash. You can't eat the new grain. So Havaminu Alima Deban Lahatir Avahanach Lo. So therefore, we need to have all the psukim. Okay?
So far, so good.
So that's that. I'm sorry?
So far, so good.
So far, so good. Okay, now it's about to get complicated. So I'm going to introduce this concept, which I find to be very, very complicated, and stop me many times if it's not clear. But so the principle that we have right now is that any karban tzibor, that the Torah says moed, which means pretty much any karban tzibor, is dochet tuma. Again, the circumstances are not entirely clear. Let's say everyone's tameh. Let's say the karban is tameh. Either way, tuma is dochet. Okay, and a karban pesach, if most of the tzibor is tameh, is dochet tuma, right? If only some of them, that we don't know what a yachid and a tzibor means. I said most, I gave it away, but we're going to discuss more what that means, right? Because we know that if one individual or maybe 10 individuals are tameh, you don't bring the karban pesach for them. They wait till Pesach Sheni. Right. But somehow, if the tzibur is tameh, then you bring the karban pesach even betuma. Right. Okay. The question is, what does that mean that you can bring a karban betuma? So there's 2 ways to understand this, and we're going to have both opinions in the Gemara. One opinion is, and the one that we don't like so much, is that tuma is hutra b'tzibur. Those are the words. Tuma is mutar when it's with the public. Tuma hutra b'tzibur. Meaning, the Torah says very clearly many times, don't do your karban b'tuma. Tuma is terrible in the Beit HaMikdash, etc., etc. But when it's public, the tuma is hutar. All of a sudden, you get a blank check. Okay, that's one understanding. The implication of that to us today, tomorrow it's going to be a different implication, is that if tuma is hutra b'tzibur, you can eat the karban presumably, because it's mutar. There's no question of tuma anymore. The second way to view it, which is the one that we think is more likely, is tuma dichuya b'tzibur. That tuma dichuya, I don't know how to translate dichuya in English very well, but it means like pushed off. It's like it's tolerated maybe, right? So that we have no alternative. We don't want to cancel the karban, so tuma, but it's pushed off. It's dichuya b'tzibur. And we understand if tuma is dichuya b'tzibur, it means that there is a sort of outside body that tolerates, that makes up for the tuma. And that outside body, if you recall, is what we call the tzitz, right? So the Gemara in Shavuot, which we're going to get to again soon, or not so soon, a few years, it talks about levels of heter, right? In Torah, it comes out that the tzitz that the Kohen Gadol wears is miratzeh, meaning this is the word ritzoy, it comforts, it makes up for tuma. So that if someone does something with tuma, the tzitz is what sort of brings it to God, bridges that avera. So we are assuming now that basically that if you hold tuma as dichuya b'tzibur, you need the tzitz to make it okay. Okay, it's okay if you have the tzitz. Now, with that introduction, says the Gemara now, Savrua, we assumed, never a good idea to make assumptions, right? But we think, Dilikuli alma tuma dichuyahi b'tzibur, that everybody in our Mishnah is of the opinion, meaning the Tana of our Mishnah, Kuliyama, of course, does not mean everybody, but the Tana of our Mishnah is of the opinion that Tuma is not mutar b'tzibur, it's just dachuy, it's just tolerated, and ba'i tzitz l'ratzot, and therefore you need the tzitz to make it okay, meaning it wouldn't be okay without the tzitz. Why do we assume that? Now, this Tosas does not like this, but let's just read it, the Gemara. We assume that the leka Tana the Shamitle, there's no Tana who we understood of the opinion, the Amar Tuma, who dropped Tzibur, El Rabbi Yehuda. The only Tana who said that Tuma is Hutar B'Tzibur was Rabbi Yehuda. So what? So Tosa says, well, what the Gemara is saying is we don't want to pass like Rabbi Yehuda. You have no idea now why we don't want to pass like Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda is such a far-fetched opinion that we're assuming that no one else agrees with it. Okay? Again, why you would say that is not so clear. What's this Breita that we're referring to? The Tanya. Says the Breita, and remember this Breita, it's one of many we're going to have to remember. Tzitz, says the Breita, the Kohen Gadol's tzitz. Bein sheyeshnu al mitzcho, bein she'enu al mitzcho miratzeh. The tzitz, which we know, the Torah says, right? The tzitz is there, the chaper al tumato. It's there to fix tuma that's done unwittingly, maybe, or in this case, wittingly because it's a tzibur, right? Let me just take a step back, right? The Gemara in Shavuot explains, if let's say you by mistake bring a karban b'tuma, you don't know about it. So there, the tzitz is meratzah, that you don't have to do it again, right? The tzitz fixes that, basically, in some contexts. So it says that the Breita, the tzitz works whether the Kohen Gadol is wearing it or not wearing it. Let's say the Kohen Gadol is not doing the avodah, or not even in the Beit HaMikdash. The existence of the tzitz is what's meratzah. It doesn't have to be on his head or not on his head, okay? Divrei Rabbi Shimon. That's Rabbi Shimon's opinion. Says Rabbi Yehuda, no way. Odeo al mitzcho meratzeh, ein odeo al mitzcho ein meratzeh. The tzitz is meratzeh, meaning it fixes things in real time. If it means if you do, it's like a get out of jail card, right? Not literally, but get out of tuma card. If you're wearing the tzitz and you do something with tuma, it's okay. If the Kohen Gadol is not wearing the tzitz, it's not okay.
Only the Kohen Gadol who wears it, right?
Only the Kohen Gadol wears it.
Not the regular Kohen.
When is he supposed to wear it?
Whenever he's doing avodah in the Beit HaMikdash.
So all the time, I mean, most of the time.
Most of the time, correct. Amar lo Rabbi Shimon, 1 second, but there's one time the Kohen Gadol does not wear the tzitz. And when is that? On Yom Kippur, right? Kohen Gadol b'Yom Kippurim yochiyah. She'inu al mitzcho meratzeh. The Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur does not wear the tzitz when he goes lifnai v'lifnim, right? Because it's gold, right? And the Torah says that. Well, it's a little debatable. The Torah seems to say that very clearly. And we rely on the tzitz to be mechaper on Tumah on Yom Kippur, right? So it must be that it must be that the Kohen Gadol's tzitz is miratzeh on tuma, whether he's wearing it or not. Says Rabbi Yehuda, I disagree. Amarlo, says Rabbi Yehuda, back to Rabbi Shimon, Hanach Yom Kippurim. You're wrong. Forget about Yom Kippur. Because Yom Kippur, every karban that's done on Yom Kippur is a karban tzibur. And so you don't need the tzitz anymore on Yom Kippur. Because Tumah, who drop it tzibur. Because if you do Tumah by mistake in tzibur, it's all mutar. And so therefore, you don't need the tzitz, is what it seems to be saying according to Rabbi Yehuda. Says Gemara, now Michlal, from Rabbi Yehuda's response, it must be Rabbi Shimon Savar that you do need the tzitz, right? That Tumah is Tuchuyahi b'tzibur. So that's assumption number one, is that everybody would agree with Rabbi Shimon that Tumah is Tuchuya b'tzibur, and the only reason it works is because the tzitz is doing it. And on Yom Kippur, when the Kohen Gadol is not wearing the tzitz, is a proof that the tzitz existence is what's matir, and not the tzitz being worn on the head of the Kohen Gadol. Okay? Now, again, this is where Tosfos is bothered. Why the heck do you assume that we're going like Rabbi Shimon and not Rabbi Yehuda? I mean, Rabbi Yehuda is a pretty valid approach. So Tosfos says it's because we're going to see later, tomorrow and in the future, that there are other Tanaim who agree with Rabbi Shimon. Okay? But either way, assumption number one is that you have Tumah, Dechuya, B'tzibur, and the only reason that you can bring a Karban B'tumah is because you have the tzitz to help fix it. But then you get into the problem because of assumption number two. What's assumption number two? We also assume, says the Gemara, where am I? Dekuli alma, that eina tzitz meratzeh al achilot. We assume that everybody agrees that the tzitz does not help things that you eat. It only helps things that you bring on the mizbeach. Why do we say that? Deleka tana deshamet leidamar tzitz meratzeh al achilot el Rabbi Eliezer. We didn't find any tana except for Rabbi Eliezer who is of that opinion, and we don't want to go like Rabbi Eliezer. Again, not so clear why. The Tanya, what's that Braita? Says the Braita again. Rabbi Eliezer Omer very explicitly, Hatzitz meratzeh al achilot. The tzitz is meratzeh on tumah that's edible, and Rabbi Yossi says, which is how we go, well, paskin eina tzitz meratzeh al achilot. Okay, and for whatever reason, again, we'll have to see this as we go, that we paskin like Rabbi Yossi over Rabbi Eliezer or Rabbi Lazar, however you use different years. So now you have two assumptions. One is that when Tumah is done b'tzibur, it's not permitted, it's tolerated, which means you need the tzitz. But the tzitz does not work for foodstuffs. So now you got a big problem. Because our Mishnah said that you can bring the karban, let's say the karban ha'omer, or the karban shtei halechem b'tumah, but you can't eat it, right? Because the tzitz only works for what's brought on the mizbeach, not for what's edible. Says the Gemara, if that's true, Nima, where am I? Nima matnitin d'lo Rabbi Yeshua. Now, with these two assumptions, our Mishnah is not going according to Rabbi Yeshua. What did Rabbi Yeshua say? You've got to keep this third bright in mind now. It says in the pasuk, "Asita olatecha habasar v'hadam." Bring your karban ola, the meat and the blood. What does that mean? Why does it say the meat and the blood? Rabbi Yeshua says, "Im ein dam, ein basar." Im ein basar, ein dam. The Torah is telling you that basar and dam go together. If there's no basar, there's no dam. Meaning, if you don't have meat left, you drop the meat, you lose it, it becomes tameh. Don't sprinkle the blood, and vice versa. If there's no blood, let's say you dropped all the blood, you can't use the meat. The fact that you shechted an animal is not okay. You need to have basar and dam. If that's true, then our Mishnah does not make any sense, because our Mishnah said that you can do this b'tumah, but the Mishnah was talking about things where the tzitz is not meratzeh on the food. And if the tzitz is not meratzeh on the food, how can you bring it on the mizbeach? You don't have any food. You can't have done. Okay? Now, before we get to answering that question, we're going to make a big aside over here. So put that aside for a second. That's the question, is that how could our Mishnah make any sense? If you're holding that tumah is duchuya b'tzibur, but the tzitz does not help fix food, right? So therefore, nothing is going to be edible from what was brought b'tumah, except for the Pesach, right? But obviously, forget about the Pesach for now. But nothing's going to be edible from what's brought b'tumah. And Rabbi Yeshua makes it sound like if you don't have meat, you don't have dam. So then how could you say you can bring the karban if you can't eat it, basically? And by definition, when it's tameh, you can't eat it. Because although you can bring it b'tumah, the tzitz is not going to fix the edible parts. So that's the question. Now, before we get to the answering the question, let's finish the Braita. That's Rabbi Yossi's opinion, Rabbi Yeshua's opinion, sorry. Im ein dam in basar, im ein basar in dam. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Rabbi Eliezer says, again, 7 lines from the bottom, no, dam afal pi she'ein basar. Blood is all that matters. Even if the meat is totally lost, either because a bird came and slapped it away, or you dropped it and you lost it, or it's tameh. It doesn't matter. You still put the blood on the mizbeach and it's still mechaper. Shenemar, because the Torah then says by the shlomim, it says the dam zivachecha yishafech. Pour the blood. It doesn't say anything about the basar. So clearly, says the Gemara, Eliezer says blood is enough. 1 second. What about the first pasuk? The first pasuk said you have to do blood and basar. Says the Gemara, says Rabbi Eliezer, Lomar lecha, that teaches you something totally different. And madam bizrika, just like when you put the blood on the mizbeach, you have to throw it. The Torah says v'zarak b'nei Aaron et hadam al mizbeach. You don't pour, you don't touch it. You throw it on the mizbeach. Af basar bizrika. When you put meat on the fire to burn, you're not supposed to place it down gently. You're supposed to throw it. And Haviomer, they said that in fact the kevesh, the ramp, was not touching the mizbeach. Lu katan yesh ben kevesh lemizbeach. There was a small hole, a small opening between the ramp, meaning they didn't actually touch. They went right up to each other. There were a couple inches between them. And you would stand on the ramp and throw the food onto the mizbeach. So it says Rabbi Eliezer, that's what the pasuk is telling me. That just like you're zorek the dam, you're zorek, you throw the basar. Okay? And you would throw it from the kevesh to the mizbeach. And it says, well, Rabbi Yeshua, who said that the basar and the dam are connected because the pasuk says, Vasita olotecha basar v'adam. What about the second verse? What about the nami haktiv? The other verse says, dam zivachecha yishafech, right? You just, and it just says dam. It doesn't say anything about the basar. Says Rabbi Yeshua, you stopped reading the pasuk. What are the next words? Haktiv gabe. It says right next to it, the basar tochal. You eat the meat. So no, I maintain that basar and dam are connected. Well, turn the page now. According to Rabbi Yeshua, so why do you need 2 verses? Why do you need vasito lotecha basar v'adam, and then you need dam zivachecha yishafech v'abasar tochal? Why do you need 2 verses to connect blood and meat and basar? Says the Gemara, v'hani trei krai lamoli. So according to Rabbi Yeshua, why do you need 2 psukim? Well, because one is written by the Ola, chad ba'ola, v'chad b'shlamim. One is written by a carbon Ola, and one is written by a carbon shlamim. B'tzricha, remember, they're very different. Dikat rachmana ba'ola. If the Torah had only told me by a carbon Ola that basar and dam are connected, I would have thought, hava amina olahi, the chamira. That's an Ola, because an Ola is very chamor, shekin kalil, right? You burn in the entire thing on the mizbeach. Avos shlamim de lo chamira, because you eat part of them, so it's not as pure a carbon. Hava amina, I would have thought, a malo, that you don't need to do both the meat and the blood. The Torah only told me by shlamim that you need the meat and the blood. Hava mina adarabba. Again, I would have thought the opposite svara. The itbush achilot. Remember that by a shlamim, you put food on the mizbeach, right? Achilat gavoa, God, and you put food that the kohanim get, and not the kohanim, the owners. Everyone gets it, right? There's shtei achilot. So therefore, you need to have both meat and blood. Aval ola the let b'shtei achilot imalo kamash malan. So says Rabbi Yoshua, you need a pasuk to tell me that blood and meat are connected, are not just connected, that they're indispensable. That you need one to have the other, both by ola and by shlamim, and that's why you need 2 psukim. And Rabbi Eliezer, so what about him now? Right? He says that the first pasuk says, the first pasuk says, Sita olotecha basar v'adam, and that tells you that just like you throw the blood on the mizbeach, you throw the basar on the mizbeach. The second pasuk says that dam zivachecha yishafech, you can just pour out the blood, telling you that all that matters is the blood. What about the fact that the next word said basar tochal? This is where Rabbi Eliezer nami aktiv basar tochal. It says you have to eat the food. Amar lecha, he says, well, that's a little different. That tells you sheina basar mutar b'achila ad she'yizrok hadam. That tells you that the basar of an animal that is, let's say a shlamim, you can't eat that until you pour the blood. Let's say they shech the animal, they accept the blood in a kos. There's a long line to the mizbeach, right? You got to wait a half hour until you get your turn to throw the blood on the mizbeach. You can't take the meat and start eating it until that blood is thrown on the mizbeach, because it says dam zivachecha yishafech. You pour out the blood, v'habasar tochal, and then you eat the basar. It says, well, maybe that's all the Torah is telling you. That dam afbishen sham basar minalan. How does Rabbi Eliezer know that if you have blood but no meat, because the meat is tameh or the meat is thrown away, that the carbon is still kosher? Amar lecha, because he says to you in Cain, if that's all the Torah wanted to tell you, nichtav rachmana basar tochal, v'hadar adam zilchecha yishafeh. It could have said the other order. It could have said first, eat the meat and throw out the blood, telling you that they're connected. Kidichtiv bereisha. That's what the pasuk said by Ola. By Ola it said, v'asita olatecha habasar v'adam. First it said basar and then dam. Why did the Torah maishna de'aktame l'dam zivachecha? Why did the Torah here switch it up and say the blood first to tell you this halacha? Shma mina dam afal b'she'ein basar, that you can bring the blood even if you have no meat left because the meat was lost or tameh. And shma mina, second of all, you see she'ein basar mutar b'achila shizrak adam, that you can't eat the meat until you do the zrikat adam. And how does Rabbi Yeshua know that? Rabbi Yeshua, Eina basar mutar la'achila shizrak adam. He learns that minale. Most they add the Bach adds mikal v'chomer. In fact, that's a kal v'chomer. Ma emurim. Now, again, this is halacha that we learned a couple weeks ago in Talmud Nishrat, that just like the limbs of an animal, remember the emurim are what goes on the mizbeach, right? And we learned in Talmud Nishrat that with the emurim, the chiletnu, if you look, let's say all the limbs of the animal become tamei or they're lost, lo ma'akve, but that's not ma'akev, right? Meaning that the carbon is still kosher. But ki itnu ma'akve, but if you do have them, you have to burn them. Meaning if you have them and don't burn them, the carbon's not kosher. So by emurim, which is a kal v'chomer, if they're not there because they were lost, you can still, the carbon's kosher. But when they're there, you have to put them on the mizbeach. Dam, the blood, the chilete ma'akev. If you have no blood of the animal to pour on the mizbeach, it's not a kosher carbon. So ki'ita lo kol shekein the ma'akev. Certainly, if you do have the blood, it has to be done first before you can eat the meat. And Rabbi Eliezer says, you're right, it's a kal v'chomer, but so what? The Torah sometimes tells us things that you can learn from a kal v'chomer to maybe reinforce it. Milta the aktiv kal v'chomer tarach v'katav lakra. The things that you learn from a kal v'chomer, the Torah will sometimes say anyways. And Rabbi Shua does not disagree with that, but he says, if you can learn something new from the pasuk, you can learn something new from the pasuk. So that's all in parentheses. Okay, just to summarize, there's an argument between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua about whether the blood and the meat are necessary, right? Let me just say that very clearly.
What do you mean necessary for what?
For kapara.
Okay, so we're not talking about a shlamim here.
No, because you bring meat on the mizbeach too.
But that's not you're not doing it lechaper, are you? Shlamim or?
No, but the question is it kosher? Did you bring your karba, right? So according to everybody, let me just reiterate this. According to everybody, you need to have the blood, right? If the blood is spilled out and there's no blood, the fact that you have meat either to put on the mizbeach or to eat at home is not okay.
Yeah.
The question is, what about the other way? Let's say you have plenty of blood to put on the mizbeach, but you have no meat left behind. And in a shlamim was saying there's no meat left behind to eat. There's nothing left to eat, right? In a carbon that you're supposed to eat.
Right.
Says Rabbi Yeshua, then the carbon's not kosher. If the meat becomes tamei and you can't eat it, don't sprinkle the blood. Throw it out because your carbon is gone. Says Rabbi Eliezer, I disagree. If you have dam, afal pishein basar. Says the Gemara, now that we've established the opinions of Rabbi Yeshua, our Mishnah makes no more sense. Our Mishnah can't be going according to Rabbi Yeshua. Not that it makes no sense, but it argues with Rabbi Yeshua. Why?
So,
Says the Gemara repeats it because it seems you forgot what it said on the off. Hashta, third wide line, right? Second wide line. Hashta, so now get back to your point. Lema matnita delok Rabbi Yeshua. It seems like our Mishnah is not going according to Rabbi Yeshua. Why? The kivan da amar be'inan tarti. Since Rabbi Yeshua says you need to have both the basar and the dam to be kosher, to be edible, right? Not edible, but kosher. And sitz achilot lo maratza, and the tzitz, which is what you need to be machshir tumah, is not miratzeh, it's not okay, does not make foodstuffs, meaning edible things, okay. So then hechi ati betuma. How could you ever bring these carbonot betuma, right? How could you bring the carbonot betuma? There's no basar. And if there's no basar, then the dam doesn't work either. So how could our Mishnah say, you can bring them betuma, though you can't eat it betuma? There's no way. Says the Gemara, no. Afilu tem Rabbi Yeshua. Our Mishnah could be going with Rabbi Yeshua. Kasavar Rabbi Yeshua, tzitz meratzah al ha'olin. When Rabbi Yeshua said that a tzitz is not meratzeh on food, it meant the food that you take home to eat, not all food. The olin, the things that are brought on the mizbeach, the limbs that you bring on the mizbeach, the tzitz is meratzeh for those. So, for example, a carbon, where you bring parts on the mizbeach, those would be okay, even if they're tamei, because the tzitz would fix that. Says we're okay. Hateinach zvachim. So that explains all the sacrifices in our Mishnah, the animals. But the olin, ela omer shtei alechem, the olin ma'ik l'memer. What about the carbon omer and the shtei alechem? You didn't bring them on the mizbeach. Now Rashi points out that the carbon omer is a regular mincha. With a mincha, if you recall, you take a kmitza and you put it on the mizbeach. So why don't you call the kmitza the olin? So Rashi explains that the kmitza is the equivalent of blood for a mincha, right? With a animal or a bird, which is an animal, I guess, you shech the animal, you take the blood, you put it on the mizbeach, and the basar is what you eat, right? A carbon mincha is just a bunch of flour and oil. So with a carbon mincha, when you take the kmitza and put that on the mizbeach, that's the equivalent of the blood of the mincha. And what's left behind is called the basar, right? So that's the carbon mincha, sorry, carbon omer. The shtei alechem, there's nothing brought on the mizbeach. Shtei alechem are completely, they just wave them and take them home and eat them. Not home. They take them to the kohanim and eat them, right? So these things, omer shtei alechem, the leka olin ma'ikel meimar, right? And again, according now to Rabbi Yoshua, if you can't have the basar, which in a mincha means the flour, right? You can't have the dam. And our Mishnah is saying that the tzitz is necessary because it's tuma. But the tzitz doesn't fix food. So if the tzitz doesn't fix food, then you can't eat the mincha. And if you can't eat the mincha, then it shouldn't be kosher. Amri says, well, I have a solution. Rabbi Yeshua only says you need the blood and the meat when you're talking about an animal. But b'menachot lo amar. Rabbi Yeshua never meant it by menachot. Menachot have their own category. They're not basar. By menachot, you don't need both. So even if there's nothing left behind that's kosher, the mincha is kosher because you don't need it. That's a good answer, but it doesn't seem to fit.
Can you repeat it, please?
Yes, sure. Very confusing, right? So Rabbi Yeshua's opinion, based on the pasuk of V'asita olotecha habasar v'hadam, is that the meat and the dam are intimately connected, and if you don't have meat that's kosher for your animal, you can't bring the dam either. So that if you have a sacrifice and the blood is perfectly fine, but the meat is totally ineligible, right? Then you can't bring that sacrifice on the mizbeach. As the Gemara now explain our Mishnah according to Rabbi Yeshua. Our Mishnah said that you could bring a karban b'tumah, right? Even though, as we're about to say, you can't eat it b'tumah, right? Now the Mishnah is assuming that we're assuming that if you bring a karban b'tumah, it only works because the tzitz makes it work. But the tzitz does not work for foodstuffs. And if the tzitz does not work for foodstuff, so then you can bring the blood on the mizbeach, but all the food, all the basar is going to be tamei, and therefore you can't bring it on the mizbeach. So how could the carbon work, right? How can our Mishnah say that chamisha dvarim ba'im b'tumah? If you can't eat them, you can't bring them. So the first answer we gave was, well, although you can't eat them, you can still bring the parts of meat on the mizbeach, and that's enough. That's basar v'hadam. We asked, but what about the mincha? What about the omer and the shtei halechem? What can you bring? You can't bring anything on the mizbeach. According to Rabbi Yeshua, it shouldn't be kosher. So the answer we gave is that Rabbi Yeshua was not talking about a mincha. Rabbi Yeshua was only saying that basar and dam when you're talking about an animal with real meat. Okay? Says the Gemara, but is that true? Ube menachot lo amar, did Rabbi Yeshua not have his opinion that, again, both the dam and the basar, which in a mincha is the kmitza and the shirayim, right, the leftover, is that true? That's not. And the Mishnah says in Menachot, the specific Mishnah says, Nitmu'u shira. Let's say the extra part of the mincha, meaning you took out a kmitza, everything else left in the pot became tameh. Says the Mishnah, or let's say avdu shira, or you lose them. Kimidat Rabbi Eliezer kshera. If you go according to Rabbi Eliezer, it's kosher, because Rabbi Eliezer says you don't need the meat in order for the dam to be okay. But Kimidat Rabbi Yeshua psula. You go according to Rabbi Yeshua, it's pasul. So the Mishnah very, very clearly says Rabbi Yeshua is talking about a mincha also, right? You got it? Stop me if it's not clear. Okay. It says, well, what the Mishnah did not mean is that Rabbi Yeshua says that. It meant that if you hold like Rabbi Yeshua and you go further than Rabbi Yeshua, kimidat, velo kimidat. Kimidat, Rabbi Yeshua, you go according to the opinion of Rabbi Yeshua, the Inan Tarti, that you need both, the dam and the basar, which again, in a mincha means the kmitza and the shirayim. but not Kimidat Rabbi Yeshua, but it's not going literally like Rabbi Yeshua. Rabbi Yeshua b'zvachim amar b'menachot lo amar. Rabbi Yeshua only said it by animals. He didn't say it by mincha. The Elohai Tana Savar Fil Menachot B'Menachot. This Tana is saying it even by a mincha. Says Gemara, well, that's really far-fetched. Because Manu Haitana, the Koy Kavatei Machmir Tzvei Minei. Where would you find the Tana who says, I hold Rabbi Yeshua's opinion, but he's not extreme enough for me. I'm going even further. Right? You never said anyone like that. And further, the Otanya, and we have another Braita. I'm going to read this Braita very quickly and not explain any of it because it's in tomorrow's daf and it's complicated. The Otanya, Amar Rabbi Yossi, says Rabbi Yossi, Roa ani et divrei Rabbi Eliezer b'menachot u'b'zvachim. I agree with the words of Rabbi Eliezer by mincha and zvachim, and I agree with the words of Rabbi Yeshua by zvachim and minachot. Now again, that makes no sense, so don't get nervous. But continues the Braita, divrei Rabbi Eliezer b'zvachim. I like Rabbi Eliezer by zvachim. Shaya omer dam. You can bring a carbon if you have blood. Afal pi she'ein sham basar, even if the meat's totally gone. And divrei Rabbi Yeshua b'zvachim. I like Rabbi Yeshua by zvachim. Shaya omer im ein dam ein basar. If you have no blood, there's no meat. Im ein basar ein dam. And I like divrei Rabbi Eliezer b'menachot because Rabbi Eliezer said by a mincha shaya omer kometz afal pi she'ein shirayim. You can bring the kometz on the mizbeach even if you have nothing left behind, right? Which is the equivalent to basar. And divrei Rabbi Yeshua b'menachot. Now this is the question. Are these words? Shahaya omer. Rabbi Yeshua says im ein kometz ein shirayim. If the kometz is lost, you can't eat the leftover. Im ein shirayim ein kometz. And if the leftover is lost, there's no kometz. Now again, the Braita makes no sense, so we're going to discuss it tomorrow. But very clearly, you see in the Braita, the Rabbi Yeshua's principle that you need both the part that's brought on the Mizbeach and the part that's left behind to be kosher applies even to a mincha. And now we're back to our problem with the Mishnah. Because the Mishnah said that you can bring the shtei halechem, even though it's tameh, right? And even though you're not going to eat what's left behind. But according to Rabbi Yeshua, that doesn't exist.
Why can't we say that the Mishnah and the Rabbi Yeshua have different points of view?
That you could say that, but we don't like this. That's the last thing we want to say, right? We want the Mishnah.
I mean,
we might get there. Don't worry, but we're trying very hard not to get there.
Okay,
but that's
the whole point here. We're trying
to make sense of the Mishnah according to Rabbi Yeshua. Correct.
Okay.
Says El Kasavar Rabbi Yeshua Tzitz Meratzah Lachilot. It must be that Rabbi Yeshua says that the tzitz is miratzeh on food. In which case, even though tumah is dechuya b'tzibor, the tzitz is enough. In which case, you can eat the mincha, you can eat the shirayim. Says the Gemara, I don't get it. Ihachi, when the Mishnah said in Minachot that if the shirayim become tameh, according to Midat Rabbi Yeshua, you burn it, right? You get rid of it, not burn it. You destroy it. Why is that true? If the tzitz is miratzeh, then even if the shirayim become tameh, let you eat them because the tzitz is miratzeh. So Midat Rabbi Yeshua psula. What do you mean it's pasul if the shirayim become tameh? According to Rabbi Yeshua, the tzitz is miratzeh. Well, that was referring to avud v'saruf. That was referring to if you lose the shirayim or they get burnt up, meaning they're lost, not if they're tameh. Ela nitma leman katani Rabbi Eliezer. So then why'd you say a mincha, carbon mincha, that became tameh, the shirayim became tameh, what's the chiddush? That's Rabbi Eliezer's chiddush. That it's tahor, that's okay, right? Because Rabbi Eliezer holds, remember, that you don't need the shirayim to be okay, as long as you have the dam. It's more pshita, but that's obvious. Hashta yesh lomar avud b'saruf deletnu. Machshir Rabbi Eliezer says that even if you lose the extra parts of the mincha, the shirayim, it's still kosher. Certainly, if it's just tameh, nitma di'ita, it's in front of you, it's just not edible. Nibai, ella pshita Rabbi Yeshua. It must be going according to Rabbi Yeshua. V'katani psula. And the Mishnah in Zvach in Nachot clearly says that if you're nitma shirah, if the shirayim of a carbon become tameh, then it's possible. But according to what you just told me, Rabbi Yeshua says it's okay because it sits, makes it okay. And further, Tanya, another Braita, Rabbi Yeshua Omer, kol zvachim shebetorah. Any carbon in the Torah, bein shenitma basar v'chelev chelev kayam. Whether the basar, remember the basar is the edible part, the chelev are the fats that are brought on the mizbeach. So whether the edible part is tameh, but the fat is okay, or bein shenitma chelev, where the fats become tameh, so you can't bring them on the mizbeach, but the basar is kayam. Then zoriket adam, that's okay. Some of the meat is there, either the fat or the meat, it's fine. Aval nitmu tervayu, lo. But if both the fat and the meat become tamei, then don't sprinkle the blood. Alma kasav Rabbi Yeshua, eina tzitz meratzel olim la'achilot. You see, Rabbi Yeshua says that the tzitz is not meratzel in the food, because even if it became tamei, you can't sprinkle the blood because the meat is not edible. So clearly the tzitz does not work. Ella says the Gemara, you're right. The olam Rabbi Yeshua he matnitin. In fact, I'm going to tell you that Rabbi Yeshua is the author, or one of the authors of the Mishnah. The lokasha kan lechatchila kan diavad. There's the chatchila and there's b'diavad. Ki amar Rabbi Yeshua lechatchila. When Rabbi Yeshua said that you have to have the basar for the dam, that's the chatchila. Ideally, if there's no basar, you shouldn't sprinkle the blood. But diavad lo, but b'diavad, he never said it. Says, that's ridiculous. And why in the world would you say that? The Tanya, right? There's a Braita which says, quotes the Braita. We had this actually a couple weeks ago. Nitma basar, right? If the basar of a korban becomes tamei, shinifsal, or it becomes pasul. Rashi says pasul means tful yom. It's pasul, not tamei, because it's just a lower level of tumah. Shiyatza chutz liklaim. Or you take it outside of the walls by mistake, which is where we had this earlier. Rebbe Eliezer says, Yizrok, you still sprinkle the blood. Again, this is Rebbe Eliezer's opinion that if you don't need the meat in order for the blood to be okay. So even though the meat is out of bounds, the blood can be sprinkled. And Rebbe Yeshua says, Lo Yizrok, you shouldn't sprinkle the blood. However, continues the Braita, Moda Rebbe Yeshua, Shim Zara, Kurtza. Rabbi Yeshua admits that if you did it, you're b'diavad, you got a kapara. So that's how you have to understand our Mishnah. That our Mishnah is saying, b'diavad, it's okay. It says, that's ridiculous. Chada, first of all, the psula, diavad mashu. Right? The Mishnah in Menachot said that if the shirayim of the mincha become tamei, Rabbi Yeshua says, pasul. That does not imply that it's okay. It implies that it's bad. And further, what does our Mishnah say? Remember, if you go back to our Mishnah today, our Mishnah said, Chamisha dvarim ba'im b'tumah. That does not sound like b'diavad. It sounds like 5 things can be done b'tumah. Ta'od, Chamisha dvarim ba'im l'chatchila mashma. It says you can do it. Ella, okay, finally, lokasha, kam b'yachid, kam b'tzibor. Well, when Rabbi Yeshua said that tumah is dichuya, that was by a korban tzibor where there's a yachid who's tameh. The Kohen is tameh, right? Or the animal is tameh, and the Kohen's bringing it. But when we're talking about in our Mishnah, we're talking about a mincha, In Menachot, we're talking of, this is how Rashi understands it. In Menachot, we're talking, and in general, when you have a yachid who's tameh, right, then it's even b'diavad, the animal would not be kosher. Meaning, if let's say I was in the Beis HaMikdash, right? I shecht my animal, I have the blood, and then the meat becomes tamei, sure, the tzitz will be meratzeh on the korban. But it's, according to Rabbi Yeshua, the tzitz is not meratzeh on food, right? Because it's only dechuya. And therefore, I can't sprinkle the blood because that meat cannot be eaten. But if it's truma of tzibor, meaning it's a korban tzibor, it's a shtei alechem, then, says Rashi, truma is hutra b'tzibor. Then the tzitz, you don't need the tzitz anymore. The tumah becomes wiped out. There's no question of tumah anymore. And therefore, basically, you pretend it's not tameh, and not only can you bring the korban, you can eat the meat. And therefore, because of that, you can sprinkle the blood because the meat would be okay. So Rashi understands, Tosfos does not like this, but Rashi understands that what we're saying now is that in a tzibor context, Rabbi Yeshua would hold tumah hutra b'tzibor. And therefore, since Tumah hutra b'tzibor, remember the whole reason we had this Gemara is that we made the assumption that Tumah is dechuya b'tzibor. And therefore, you need the tzitz to make it okay, and the tzitz only works for certain things, not for other things. Says the Gemara now, Rabbi Yeshua holds Tumah hutra b'tzibor in a tzibor context, and therefore, you're allowed to, even though it's tamei, all the meat's okay, all the blood's okay, and that's why our Mishnah says, Chamisha dvarim ba'im b'tumah. But there are 5 things that can be brought b'tumah. And we'll stop there because it's too much, I think, for one day, and it's an hour. And tomorrow we'll continue. It's not that much easier tomorrow, but hopefully a little bit easier now that you have some of this context. Okay?
Okay.
Thank you, Ellie.
Tomorrow morning, 7:30.
Yep.
After all of this
Shabbat
stuff about
tov.
Tuma and stuff like that, now I learned that it's not, you can overcome it after
Sure.
like,
We're going to do much more of this because with Pesach, remember, Pesach is unique. This is all talking about Tumat Tzibor. But
right,
Pesach is an individual carbon, and you can overcome it also.
okay.
We'll get there.
Unbelievable.
Okay, Shavuot Tov. I'll see you tomorrow morning. I hope 7:30.
Be well.